What's going on YouTube? My name is Z Crims. Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be putting Öhlins Road and Track Coilovers on my E90 M3. Most of the videos, they are really annoying. The people don't shut up and you don't learn a damn thing on how to actually put the coilovers on your car. So welcome to the step-by-step guide, and let's begin. Real quick, I'd like to give a special thanks to Jackie at King's Automotive. He let me use his team and his lift to make this video, and I truly appreciate it. If you're in New Jersey, specifically North Jersey, and you need any work done to any E9X or honestly any M3 in general, Jackie and his team are the perfect place to do it. So first thing is the boxes. In the bigger box, you have your struts and shocks, and in the smaller box, you have your springs and all that stuff. We are going to be using a lift today. If you do not have a lift, that's fine. You can go on jack stands. First thing you need to do is loosen all your nuts on all of your wheels, because when the car is in the air, you're going to have a hard time doing that. So do that first, get it on your jack stands, and we'll begin. I'm gonna start in the rear. First thing you do is remove the back cover. Literally just pulls out, just like that. Next, what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove this here, and then there's gonna be 4 pops right in the back here, and this cover will come right out. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is remove these 3 pop rivets in the trunk. There's one right here in the corner. Here's the second one up there, and the third one is right over there.
And it's going to be kind of caught on the seat cushion here, so you just have to kind of persuade it to come out.
Got it.
Make sure this clears the rear seat release. What's that?
Perfect.
And we've exposed the rear shock cover. It's going to be here.
Yeah. Shock's right under there. And as you can see, the plug right there is for the EDC suspension, if that's what you have. So for the passenger side, it's pretty much the same procedure. The only difference is you have to remove this tray here. So you turn that and it just pops right out. And then there's going to be the same 3. There's 1 pop rivet, there's another, and then there's another, and then same thing, pops right out. So we're gonna start in the rear. The first thing you need to do on the driver's side is you need to undo the ride height sensor, which is right here. It's just a 10mm nut, and it should come right off. Then what we're gonna do is we're gonna loosen these 2 bolts here and here, and what's gonna happen is this arm is gonna swing down. You do not need to mess with the one back here, because this bushing actually has a bearing in it, so it lets the arm swing freely.
Chances are it'll spin with you, both sides, so you'll put a 10mm socket on the front, and then with a pair of pliers, just pull the back end of it. Once you feel the tension break loose, that, you can just let that hang freely. No need to do anything. Probably just put the nut back on the stud so you don't lose it. And then you can continue on.
So you're gonna notice in the rear that only one of the bolts has a nut and this one doesn't. You're not missing a nut, don't worry. It's just that the threads are built into the arm for this one, so don't freak out. Before you take these two bolts off, take your jack and put just a little bit of preload on this arm here. We have one of these, so we're not using a jack, but use your jack. This way the spring doesn't shoot out in your face when you undo these bolts.
It's a 21 on the back side, the nut, and the bolt is actually also a 21.
Yeah, so counter hold on the back. Big breaker bar on that one.
You have to be really careful when you're putting them back in, just because the threads are aluminum. They're very easy to strip out. Very easy,
So no air tools.
No, definitely not.
All by hand on the way in. So now you're gonna slowly lower your jack and the spring will come undone. And the rear shock is gonna hang freely because we did not do the top one yet. So arm swings down, spring comes out. So now that all that's loose, come to the top of the car. If you have EDC, you just take this rubber thing off and then you see that connector, you squeeze it and it comes right off. There's no special tool you need or anything like that. Just squeeze it, it comes off. Then you're gonna counter hold the nut and undo it, but we'll get to that in a second.
So this is the pass-through socket. What we'll do is that we'll get this on the actual nut of the strut, and then we'll hold the actual the strut. It's in the shape of a hex. It's about a 10 millimeter hex. So we'll get this on there and we'll spin it while counter holding it with the wrench. So it gets on like that. We'll counter hold it. This 10 millimeter, and we'll just turn it. It's pretty tedious, but
The only way to do it, right?
yeah. Some people will just gun it off. If you're unlucky and you try to spin it like that, you'll spin the actual strut itself inside of the housing of the shock, and you can wear out the seal prematurely. So once you have the bolt loose, you just want to be careful because there's a washer under here that has a bushing, the top portion of the bushing built into it. Once you take the bolt out, the strut will want to fall straight down, but it's very important to be careful not to lose this washer, because you may have to reuse it during the installation of your new suspension. What can happen is this washer, when I'll show you in a little bit, can fall somewhere in this wheel well and it'll become trapped. It'll be very hard to get it out. So it's always good to be mindful to at least keep your hand on it, so that you can pull it out easy.
So now with everything unbolted, you just pull the arm down and the shock will come with it. Just like that. If you're on the ground, you may need to lift the car up just a little bit more to get more room to pull it out, but you should be okay for the most part.
To set up the rear shock absorber for the Öhlins, at first they want you to cut the dust boot. In the kit, they have 4 of these. They're all the same length. They might not look like they're the same length because they may get compressed during shipping, but they want you to cut it 32 millimeters from the bottom. This picture is actually pretty accurate to size, so I actually just count up. So it should be 1 full notch and then a half. So that's what I do. Go 1 full notch and a half. You can just make a quick little cut, and then I finish it off with a scissor. Okay, so now once you get that cut, we're gonna go grab our Öhlins damper. Alright, so out of the box, it'll come just like this. You're gonna want to take off the rebound adjuster because we do have to slide some stuff over it. This bushing is actually not attached as well, but you're gonna want to slide this over first, the boot. And then grab the other shock. So we do need some hardware from the old shock. After you slide on the bellow, you're gonna want to take the support cup off the old shock. It just pushes off. After that, we'll be done with the original stuff. So after you take that off, you just slide it onto the Öhlins. Then you get the Öhlins supplied bushing. This is for the EDC models. For the non-EDC models, they'll have this in your old hardware. This usually stays stuck to the frame of the car. So after you take out the stock shock, you can just kind of pull this out. But for non-EDC models, you'll want to utilize the stock bushing. For the EDC ones, you'll want to use the Öhlins supplied one. This should just slide through with the taper facing up. Then you reuse your stock hardware. Looks like yours is a slight tear, but I don't think it will make a huge difference. So once you pull out the stock metal bushing, you want to slide this in. And this will actually be ready to go into the car. Öhlins also gives you these 2 lower bushings. Just make sure you slide them in. I usually slide them in once I'm ready for the install because they just fall right out if you're not careful and you don't want to lose them. So this is what it will look like fully assembled before going into the car. Once we go in the car, we'll slide on the lower bushings. You're actually going to need to use the stock upper shock mount as well, but we'll take a look at that once we're in the car.
And then this dampener goes on last once everything's done, or does it go on now?
It goes on last because
okay,
you still have to. If you put the damper on now, you won't be able to get the stock.
Yeah, fair. All right.
So we'll get back
throw
in the car in just a little bit. All right. So now for the rear spring, Öhlins recommends you to set up at 37 millimeters of thread from the top of this adjuster to the bottom of the lock ring. So first we're gonna throw a lock ring on all the way. I have my caliper set to 37 mil, so pay note to the orientation of this. This is actually the receiver for the spring, so you need to make sure that this is definitely facing down. Alright, so now you will want to measure 37 millimeters from the top of this adjuster to the bottom of this lock ring. So let's see if we are close. Definitely need a little more out. Should be about it. So again, just like the other ones, we're going to want to lock in the position so it doesn't shift on us while we're installing. And then, so the way the rear spring will go in is I always keep the letters facing up. I don't think it's actually a directional spring, but just this will be going into the top of the car. And then on the bottom, this will go into your control arm. They give you a little spring seat. You're not going to reuse the stock rubber. You're not going to reuse stock anything for this spring, actually. So this will go in the bottom of the control arm, and this will press against the frame. Later we'll show you on the car that there's a little receiving cup for the stock spring that needs to be tapped out.
Okay, so once you have the spring set up and you're ready to install it, the first thing we're going to want to do is take note of this black metal cup. It's for the OEM spring. In a coilover application on this car, you actually want to remove this. So all it takes is, it's pressed in there, it's not even in there that much. All it'll really take is to get like a rubber mallet and just tap it in the corner, and it should pop right out. There's nothing securing it, it literally is just pressed in there. The spring, it actually has its own shape that'll fit perfectly in that crevice. So all you'll need to do is just swing this control arm down and just sneak this in here. Also take note of this black race that serves as like a kind of washer for the lower control arm. So you'll slide the spring in, and then snug it up against here. Probably put the race in first, obviously. You put the race in first over this little hump. There's no particular direction. You can just set it down. It'll locate itself. And then just rotate the spring so you can see that nice Öhlins logo. And the spring's set to be a little bit lower, so that's why it's not really under any tension. Once we introduce the actual shock, you have the spring set. Once you have the spring installed, you're just going to want to pull down the control arm again. Snake this through. And it'll sit in just like that. Your coilover kit will come with these inner races that extend the inner race of this strut. The reason why you want to make sure you put these in is because without it, this will just wobble inside the lower control arm because it's not as wide as the OEM shock is. So you'll want to make sure that once you have it installed, just push back up on it and slide them in just so that it extends it and it stays solid within the lower control arm. So just slide in just like that. And then now you can see there's no play. So once you're ready to start putting the bolts in, you want to make sure that you put the bolt for the actual shock itself in first. The reason why is because when we explained in the beginning, the threads in the lower control arm are built, they're integrated into the lower control arm and they're aluminum, so they're very fragile. And what will happen if you don't put this bolt in first, and let's say you put this outer one in first, it'll be very hard for you to locate the thread on the opposite side. And what will happen most likely is that you will cross thread it, thinking that you'll think that it's dead straight, but it'll be off just enough to cross thread it, and you'll kind of be screwed at that point. So you want to make sure you get this bolt in first. There's no tension on the shock itself, so you're free to wiggle it. You move it around until the thread locates itself. You just want to keep turning it. And once you feel like you've got a decent thread engagement already, you're free to take your wrench and just turn it slowly. Without any tension pulling it either way, the thread will find itself and it'll just screw all the way through, and you'll see it actually poke out the opposite side of the control arm. And once it gets to that point, you'll know that you're home. This is probably the hardest part of the installation in the rear, is just getting this bolt to line up properly. The reason why it's difficult is because this lower control arm controls your camber. And when you release a tension, you naturally develop positive camber, and it doesn't really line up with the bolt anymore. So you'll have to play around with this. If you're doing it on the floor, it's really difficult. You'd probably have to play around with the jack, lifting it, raising it. What works for us is we'll simply just wrap a rag around like a pry bar or like a thick screwdriver, and we'll pry in this crevice right here in between the shock and the actual the hub, and we'll just pry the bottom outward so to introduce a little bit of camber. You can see it flexing forward, and we'll play around with that at different height settings until we can actually achieve the angle that we need. It's literally just playing around. A lot of people get stuck at this point because they can't get this bolt to line up properly. The good thing about it though is once you get it in, you can smack it through. There are no threads that you have to worry about. If you see, we're almost there. So you'll want to just try to fish this through. Maybe wiggle around. If you feel like you're like 90% in, you can get it in, smack it with a hammer. You can get it in, maybe smack it with a hammer. So we cleared the first end, but now we have to clear the back end. If you look at the back end here, it's tough to see, but we're almost there. So we'll do the same thing. We'll jiggle it around, we'll flex it a little bit more, while also tapping on the head of the bolt so that we can help it find its way. Perfect.
Here it is.
And then you could throw your nut on it and finish preloading the suspension.
So when you're preloading the suspension on the arm, let's say you are on a jack stand, you want to see it lift very slightly here. And then once it lifts very slightly there, you'll know that you're preloaded.
You may not be able to visibly tell, but you can tell that it's off the lift because all of the weight is off of it. You can actually just jiggle this on.
Yep.
It's a little scary, but just be careful. If you
Be
have
very
ramps,
careful.
if you have ramps, you can also use ramps. This is just our way of doing it. We have a lift available, and it's pretty safe. So the specs for this outer lower control arm bolt is around 100 Newton meters. This one for the shock, it's between 30 and 40 Newton meters, and then you want to give it an extra 90. This one you don't want to go too tight on because the threads are aluminum. You don't want to strip them out. But this one is pretty tight. So like I said, 100 Newton meters, and then we'll say 37, and then an extra 90 degrees, and you should be fine.
All right.
So before you wrap everything up and you walk away, don't forget to bolt your headlight level sensor back. It's a 10 millimeter. If you kept your nut on it, you can just stick it through here. Stick it through there and tighten it back up. There's no real torque spec for it. It's just go until it's a little tight. Keep in mind that the thread, the actual stud portion of it is not that thick, so you don't want to tighten it too tight. But once you have the bottom end all assembled, you'll notice that the actual strut tower, the actual shock is poking through, and you're ready to finish the assembly. For this part of the installation, you want to refer to your manual, the user manual for the specific kit that you may have. In this case, Öhlins called for us to reuse this washer and bushing that we retrieved earlier. We're gonna put that in first. We're gonna use the washer they supplied us to stack on top of it. Then we'll thread on the bolt that they supplied us with, and then finally we'll put the dampener on. In terms of presetting the dampening, you want to do that after the installation is complete and it's sitting on the ground. We'll go over that later on in the video, but for now, this is how the rest of the assembly is going to look like. Like I said, we'll push this washer in, and then we'll thread this down. This is a 14 millimeter, so you're going to need a 14 millimeter socket. Just thread it down. The torque specs are between 30 and 40 Newton meters as well. At this point, you're ready to throw on the dampeners and start setting the dampening. We'll explain later on how we're going to proceed with that. Just like in the rear on the driver's side, in the front you also have a leveling sensor too. So the same way we started with the level sensor in the rear, we're going to want to start with the level sensor in the front. So it's the same procedure. It's just a 10 millimeter nut on the front side of this. You'll counter hold it in the back and it should come right out. So the next step that we'll do is we'll undo the tie rod. It's a 21 millimeter socket. for the sake of being a little bit quicker and efficient, we'll apply pressure with the screw jack, but at home you can apply pressure with a floor jack, and we'll get all the tension up here so that we can break the bolt loose. It's a 21mm socket. The reason why we do this is to apply pressure towards the inner race of this tie rod so that it doesn't spin with the bolt when we try to break it loose. That's the mentality behind it. So we'll just give it enough to where we feel that there's actually sufficient pressure, and then we'll start going at it. Once the nut comes out, the tie rod should just be ready to drop out once you relieve the tension. You might have to wiggle the whole hub, but usually these aren't seized in there that bad to the point that they can just drop out just like that. The next step, we'll just tackle the two control arms. We have the tension strut right here, which is an 18mm socket. It's just a bolt. The thread is actually built into the subframe. And then you also have this 18mm bolt right here with the 18mm nut on the end of it. Once you have the bolt out, it'll literally just drop out. As simple as that. And that's it. Counter hold it with another 18mm on the rear of it. So as you're taking this bolt out, the boot of the actual tie rod will get in your way. What you can do is just try to lift it up, the free tie rod, and just push the boot up as you're guiding the bolt out. It's never going to be enough. The bolt might graze against the actual boot of the tie rod. Don't worry about it. It's not enough to actually tear the boot, but for some reason BMW designed it like that. So, I mean, you can just push up on it and guide the bolt out as it comes out. So unfortunately, this arm won't just drop out. You'll actually have to push the entire assembly, swing it outward to get it to guide it outward.
Yeah, a little bit of persuasion never hurts. If you're working under your car, you probably will have a harder time. Yeah.
So you see, as the whole strut assembly swings outward, this will move. This is the lateral control arm. So we'll just swing it outward and then let it hang. Also, you might want to tie this up. This is the level sensor. Right now, it's just hanging by the actual harness itself. Don't leave it like that. Just hang it somewhere. You can use a zip tie or something.
Yep.
So the next step would be to unbolt the caliper. But before you tackle the caliper, you want to make sure you unplug the brake pad wear sensor, which is right here, and also the ABS sensor. Don't unplug it from the knuckle itself. There's actually a little box that they plug into, which is tucked up here. So if you just grab a flathead screwdriver and pop these little latches open, it'll expose the two plugs for them. They're color coded, so you can't really get them mixed up. The white one is the brake pad wear sensor, and the gray one is the ABS. And they come apart pretty easily. All you gotta do, there's a little push tab right here. Just push it in and pull them, separate them. Same with the ABS.
It's winter in the Northeast right now, so sorry for all the salt.
Yeah. And then the only thing holding these to the body of the car are these little grommets right here. So you'll just want to push them out and let them hang freely. The reason why we do this is so when we drop the entire strut assembly with the rotor and everything, we don't want these to be pulled and actually rip a wire internally. So it's best to just disconnect these first so you don't forget about them. But it's fine to let them hang freely. And then next, finally, we'll get these caliper bolts. They're 18mm top and bottom. So once you have the bolts or the caliper loose, you don't want to let it just drop. So what you're going to do is you're just going to slide it off the rotor. I recommend buying probably like a set of hangers. You can get them on Amazon for pretty cheap. You want to thread the bolt back into the back of the caliper and then use it as an anchor point to hang the hanger. And then at this point, you'll hook it and hang it right here on this little ledge, this little lip of the subframe. And that'll keep all the tension off of the brake hose. So after all that, the next step would be to unbolt the sway bar link right here. The actual nut portion of it is a 16 millimeter, but it's hard to see here, but it's actually another hex on the inside. What you can use to counter hold it is a 17 millimeter wrench, open-ended, and just loosen it. Once you screw off the actual nut of the sway bar, you'll see that the actual stud portion of it is like cocked at an angle. That's just because of the suspension. The sway bar is still a little bit tight. So all you can do to alleviate it is just pull down on it. Just pull down on it a little bit. Slide the sway bar link outward. Put the nut back on it so you don't lose it. And then we'll be ready to drop it from the top. The final step into removing everything is to just unplug the EDC. It's a little cover that just pops open, and the same way in the rear, the same way we just pulled it up and off of the strut is the same way we do it in the front. It just pulls, it disconnects, and that'll expose the top of the strut. All that's left is these 3 13 millimeter nuts right here. We'll just unloosen that, and then the whole strut assembly will be ready to drop out. If you're doing it by yourself, you might want to keep a jack underneath just to keep the weight up so it doesn't drop and hit the floor. If you have somebody to give you an extra hand, that's probably the best way to do it. While you're unbolting these nuts, somebody can hold the strut up so that when it does drop, it doesn't hit the floor.
Back? Yeah.
Now the whole thing just comes out nice and easy.
Like a little baby.
Heaviest little baby.
I'm sure you've seen on the internet a lot of people, they don't undo a couple things and they try to swing it out and pull the strut out. That's a lot more work than just taking the entire assembly out, and you have a high chance of nicking your fender, which we don't want to do. So take the whole thing out and then separate it.
So once you have the whole strut assembly out, the next step would be to actually get this pinch pulled out. It's just a 13 millimeter, a 16 millimeter on both sides, and the whole bolt. So you'll just loosen this. Once you get the bolt out, just get this ABS sensor unplugged, this little bracket, make sure you keep hand, you don't lose it. And at this point, all that's left is to just chisel this opening to be a little bit wider so that it can allow the strut, the actual shock itself, to come out. So like I said before, you want to try to get this opening, this little opening right here, as wide as possible, because that when this is wider, it's less clamping force on the actual body of the strut. So we have just an extra thick chisel right here, and we'll just try to split this open. There it is. There you
Big
have it.
rubber mallets, what did it?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect.
All right, so now that we have the front strut out, what we're gonna need to do is compress the spring so that we can release the strut mount. We will need to reuse the strut mount, this upper washer and the lower washer, and the rest we use from the Öhlins kit. So any spring compressor will do. This we just got from AutoZone. We have an air operated one too, but a little too lazy to go get the air hose right now. So we're gonna use this.
Plus, you could buy one at $30 at Harbor Freight, and it does the
Yeah.
same thing. But
Make sure you get like this style. The claw style one from like Harbor Freight, not that great. All right, now the top strut nut is a 21 mil. They're usually on there pretty tight, so what I like to do is just break it initially loose with this. You don't want to take it out the full way because you'll just spin the shock. So once you relieve that tension, I just counter hold it. You're never really supposed to turn from the center point, but since the tension is already released, it's not that tight. So for me, I just get a ratcheting and I turn the whole strut with me. Got the nut off, we pull off the shock mount. So we'll need to reuse this. The shock mount, this will separate. If it does, don't get scared. That's just a bearing. Try to keep dust and dirt out of there. This just goes back on. Then we need this washer. And then that's all we'll need off the old strut. Obviously, we'll need to transfer the sway bar link over at the end, but we'll leave those on there for now. Relieve the tension. Luckily for the Öhlins and almost all coilovers and most lowering springs, you don't need to recompress it because it's lower. So you can put the spring compressor away. All right, now to set up the front struts, you have to be careful because they are directional. This I already marked driver's side, but you'll just want to compare it to your old strut, and that will determine the position of it. You can find out the position of left. It's dictated by the sway bar mount, the sway bar link mount. The nut is going to come through this side, so you know we'll just grab the driver's side one and I'll show you. Stock driver strut. Basically the nut will be on this like beveled end. Basically this is how you'll line it up. And that's basically it. So this determines our driver side. Now, Öhlins recommends to set the preload of this at 6mm. So we'll just set this at 6. Yeah, so 6mm from the bottom. We'll just spin it down. It's kind of already there. That's basically it. You'll want to lock your rings just so they don't really move on you while you're throwing everything on. Afterwards, in the Öhlins kit, they give you a little spring insulator. Just throw that on top. We'll grab the Öhlins spring. And we'll actually have to set up the dust boot as well, just like the rears. They want you to cut them. They say to cut it roughly 62mm from the bottom. Again, I just count the lobes, so it should be 1, 2, 3, 3.5 up. So 1, 2, 3, 3.5. So the rest of the setup will basically go like this. You have the lower spring seat, the dust boot, the spring, the original bottom washer here. Pay notice to the orientation, it just goes down like that. And your stock strut mount, the original washer that's on top, which goes like that. And then they'll give you a new locking nut for the top. So you have the spring set up and the bellow. Set that in there. Drop this down. Oh, for the strut mount, there is a location for where the stock spring has made an imprint. I just line it up to there, to the position of the new spring. Just like that. Get it there, and then you throw on the new nut. And then we tighten it down and it should be ready to go into the car. Alright, so to tighten down the strut, the Öhlins nut is a 19 mil. The center is a 6mm hex or Allen. I just counter hold it and tighten it down.
Once you have the entire strut assembled, now it's time to reinsert it back into the knuckle. So, I mean, the same way it came out is the same way it goes back in. It's just a little easier. You'll notice that there's a lot of play, like it's really not tight. So you want to make sure that you clamp it down with the original bolt before you actually start moving the knuckle, because it will drop out. So just, you'll want to...
And then I think this lines up here, right?
Yeah, yep. So you want to make sure this is perfectly centered in the middle. And then you can go and install this like that. And like we said before, it's a 16mm nut and a 16mm bolt. So you'll just want to grab those and crank it down until it's really tight. There's no, Öhlins doesn't list a torque spec on it. You just want to go as tight as you can get it before, until you start noticing that it won't turn anymore. Okay, so when you're ready to insert this back into the car, it's pretty heavy. So you most likely want to grab a friend if you can, if you have.
Hopefully you have friends.
One thing you want to take note of is this pin right here. You want to make sure that this pin finds its way into the actual body of the car. It may be a little hard to see, but it's
You can see it.
it's about right here.
Yep.
It's about right here. Make sure that you line it up as best as you can beforehand, so you have less adjusting to do when you're actually hoisting it up. And yeah, once you're ready, just literally heave-ho it up and try to get the studs to pass through the strut tower. Have your friend guide you from up top. So once you have the strut hanging, you're free to start the installation from underneath. We'll start with the tie rod just to give it some stability while it's hanging. So what we'll do is we'll just poke this through and just get the nut on it. We're not going to tighten anything just yet because we have to preload the suspension. So we'll just let it hang like that for now. Next up, we'll tackle this lateral arm. You want to do this one first, just because to place it in this hole is a little tricky, and you need as much side-to-side play as possible. You'll want to start with this arm. Find the hole. Give it a few love taps. That one's in. We'll throw the nut on that one. Lastly, we'll get this tension strut in. It's the same concept, but this tension strut only has a bolt, I'm sorry. It's not an actual bolt and nut, it's just a nut because the actual nut portion is this little clip that's clipped onto the side of the subframe that actually has a thread built into it. It's right here. The good thing about this design is that since it is a clip, if you did accidentally start to cross thread it, this will push itself out so it won't actually destroy it. So it's very easy to find this thread. So and then we'll just tighten it down about 90%. And you can see it poking out. And that's it for the control arms. What we'll do now is we'll actually bolt up the caliper. So it's just this 18mm bolt right here. At this point, the entire suspension assembly is sitting straight, so we can line it up pretty easily and just wiggle it on. You may find that you need to press out your brake pads a little bit just to allow a clearance. But you just gotta play around with it. This part you don't really want to hit with a hammer because you can actually chip your brake pads. So it's best to just do it by hand and just wiggle it back and forth. There it is. Once it's in, just hold it up and just start threading the 18mm bolts in. These you actually can tighten down. These aren't a part of the suspension, it's just a brake. So these, when you preload the suspension, these are unaffected. So you're free to tighten these down.
We will have to reuse the stock sway bar links. You know, if you have your adjustable ones, then you can skip this step, and you got new links, you can skip this step. But the front nut is a 16, and then the back a counter hold it with a 19. So once we have the sway bar end link separated from the stock strut, the upper portion of the end link, Öhlins actually supplies you with a tapered washer. Obviously you'll want to meet convexity to concavity. Just slide that in, and this will actually go against the Öhlins strut perch. So we have to adjust that in a sec. But
The last thing you want to do is install the sway bar links. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward. Sway bar link just pokes out through here, comes down to the bottom of the sway bar right here. You want to get your 16mm nuts on both ends. To counter hold it when you're tightening this down, it's a 17 up here. Up top, you may not need to counter hold it. You shouldn't. If you do, you probably just need to use some needle nose pliers on the back end of it, but we'll just tighten that. Preload the suspension, and then you should be good from that point on. So we're just gonna clamp down on the actual housing of the coilover. Make sure it doesn't go in there. Okay. Now what we're gonna do is we're just gonna lower the car. We're gonna lower the lift onto this jack stand, onto the screw jack, so that the suspension can compress upward, and that'll start to preload the suspension. At home, what this will look like is you and a floor jack pumping the suspension upwards until you can see it actually start to lift off the lift. It's gonna happen very slowly, so it may be hard to notice, but that's the idea behind it. Be about it. It's hard to see it, but you'll notice once the car actually starts to raise instead of the suspension, it'll be easy to see in person. This one you can gun down if you have an impact. It's probably better if you have an impact, because a lot of the times it's hard to counter hold these because the actual fitting for the Torx socket that you would use to counter hold it is probably stripped out. So if you have all the weight preloaded, it's actually easier to just gun it down. You don't want to crank on it too hard. It's not going to strip out, but you just want to suck it up and then give it a few extra ooga-doogas. But from this point on, we'll just tighten the tension strut right here. The order, there is no specific order that you should tighten them in. It's just whatever is loose. Everything that you left loose, now you should tighten. So we got this 18mm bolt right here. We have this 18mm nut and bolt right here. Just gun this down. we'll do the sway bar link, which is a 16 millimeter and a 17 millimeter counter hold. And the counter hold, it will use a 17 millimeter wrench. Just tighten this down. All the torque specs are around 100 Newton meters, but if you don't have a torque wrench, well, you can just snug it down and then give it an extra 90-degree turn, and it should be fine from that point on. Don't forget this headlight level sensor, also torque that down. It's just a 10 millimeter. There it is. And there she is.
So with the dampening, on the directions it says that there's 20 settings of dampening, and for road and track use, or back roads use, you should be right in the middle at 10. Here's the thing that they don't tell you, which we figured out the hard way. There's actually 32 clicks, and apparently the first 12 clicks do nothing. So you have to count to 12, and then it's 1 to 20. So make sure you count to 12 and then 1 to 20. The issue is we can't figure out, at least not yet, if it's open or closed. So we're just going to have to figure it out. I'm going to have to drive and see if it's too stiff or too soft, and then I'll figure it out that way. So I can't help you guys with that. But remember, it's either 12 clicks from open or 12 clicks from closed, and then you have to count 1 to 20 depending on how stiff you want it. So that's how you're going to dampen these coilovers. And again, shame on Öhlins for not putting this in the manual. It's very frustrating. So after you figured out what you want to do for dampening, put the covers back on. If you have EDC, they don't plug in anymore, so you're going to have an error on your dash. And now we're going to reinstall the carpet. So I think that overall the installation was pretty smooth. Shout out again to King's Automotive. If you guys need anything in New Jersey, specifically North Jersey, they are the go-to. They are the fitment kings. Really great work. And again, thank you. But we did have some issues with the kit. First of all, one of my spring perches, if you will, the threads were completely messed up, so we had to fix that a little bit to slide on the adjuster that was in the rear. And then the second issue that we had was for one of the rear struts, they didn't machine it properly. So there was actually a manufacturing issue, and we had to actually machine it just slightly so that we could fit one of the grommets over the actual strut itself. Other than those two issues, it rides amazing, and I'll be doing another video on comparing stock versus the Öhlins, so you guys can get a good look at that. But until next time, thank you very much for watching. Give it a thumbs up, comment, subscribe, let me know what you think, and see you later. Peace!